But I think the idea is Larry's going to give us a little more background information and then take us upstairs to pick out a couple of pieces, because I know when we did the walkthrough, we kind of just all walked on our own, and Larry's going to delve into a couple of pieces upstairs. So welcome, welcome, Larry.
I don't think I need this. Yes, do I need this?
Nice to know what you just
We do need you to use it, Larry.
Do I need this?
Yes.
Okay, is this better?
No.
No? Okay, is that okay? Is that better? No? And really, with all this technology, it's really difficult to just depend on having close-at-hand conversations. And that's what I love about situations like this morning and when I used to work here, is the conversations that I would enjoy having with each and every one of you. Both things that were of interest to me and things that may or may not evolve into exhibitions or acquisitions for the collections of American and regional art. But I thought we'd just start very briefly here with an introduction to Awakening and this art of the artist Ryo Toyonaga. I know most of you, if not all of you, were at the opening reception and the Friday preview and the weekend gallery talk. I have to say that I was extraordinarily surprised how comfortable and how articulate and how clear Ryo Toyonaga was when he was asked to share publicly these ideas and these concepts about his art. I never thought in looking at his work that it was challenging, although when you begin to look at the separate elements of his work and his palette, some may come with a first impression that it was grotesque. I mean, there's dark, rich blacks and blues. There are these areas where in a man or human form of architecture and built environment, it looks like there's been chaos, there's been sort of remnants of something quite traumatic or quite aggressive having taken place with the rubble of these architectural remains. But we could talk a little bit about that upstairs in more depth. But the idea for this exhibit, Awakening, came in 2010. So it takes 3 to 4 years for exhibitions, and at least it takes for me 3 or 4 years for these exhibitions to come to fruition. And came after one of my first visits to New York when I was working on another project, a book of letters by the artist Morris Graves. And I was visiting New York because it happened to be a city where 2 of Graves' closest friends were living. And Mandy Johnson, who's the daughter of Marion Willard. Marion Willard was the extraordinary gallerist who, in the early 1940s, all the way through the 80s, represented artists from our region in the Northwest: Mark Tobey, Kevin Callahan, Morris Graves. And then the second person was Alvin Friedman Keene. And Alvin Friedman Keene met Morris Graves while living in Dublin in 1955. And from that date until Graves' death, was a dear and loyal friend, and they corresponded throughout this period of time. So if you're all interested in Graves and Keene and Marion Willard, those letters are right next door in special collections. So Alvin Friedman Keene is married to Ryo Toyonaga. And so when I first went to visit Alvin and talking about these letters, which were quite personal between Graves and himself, I was struck by the artwork of this artist who was unknown to me. And so the first 2 works I saw were the works that we chose for the cover of the catalog. And so there was a sculptural piece that was originally in earthenware that was cast into bronze. And then there's this beautiful scenic littoral scene that's on the title wall, Untitled C1 2010. All of his works are untitled, but they're simply coded. And so if you haven't, I don't like labels and titles to a certain extent on artwork, but C basically simply is color. C1 means it's the first color painting he did, and this happens to be in 2010. We'll also talk in more depth of a painting which is the most recent painting in the exhibition, and that is C18, I believe. And so it's the 18th painting he's done in color. So, and then all of the sculptures are of course untitled and just keyed by dates. So I was completely impressed. I mean, I was just overwhelmed by this painting in particular that I first saw in New York when visiting Elvin and Friedman's home. Elvin Friedman Keynes and Rio's home in New York, and this is a very large painting, and it was just so commanding. It had such a presence, and that every time I would go and visit Elvin about the Morris Graves project, we'd end up talking to Rio, and certainly Rio would gradually become comfortable with me asking him questions, because I have to respect when I begin to speak with artists that I don't get too far into trying to determine, intent, sources of creativity, influences. Eventually, I come to my own conclusions about those concerns that I have as a historian. And sometimes an artist is readily conversant about some of those inquiries, but often they're not. And sometimes it's just not something they wish to share or have even thought about. And so one of the ways that I was able to get Rio to talk about not his influences, but artists that he respected, would be to go to exhibitions with him. So a year and a half ago, Rio came to visit me when I was living in Portland. And so we would walk through galleries and an installation at the Portland Art Museum of modern contemporary art. And so we began to talk about artists that he responded to. And sometimes not, we would make these connections between what an artist like Philip Constant was doing with figurative painting and the impressions that Rio had in looking at Augustan painting. In the catalog I write about going to Storm King and seeing this extraordinary, impressive work by Noguchi. And then for the first time beginning to talk to Rio about his heritage in Japan. Rio is a contemporary artist who happens to be based in New York. And whether or not you begin to draw in his heritage and what we know of modern contemporary art, culture, history of Japan, it's up to you, because sometimes it's there, and that's based on, I think, our own experiences, our own perspectives. I see it sometimes, and I see it certainly in C1, and I allude to that, but it's not necessarily something that Rio configured, subconsciously and consciously as he begins to draft out and consider subjects or lines or compositions of his paintings and or his sculpture. So Rio was born in 1960 in Matsuyama, Japan. Matsuyama, Japan is actually an island in the island nation state of Japan. And so you access it by hydroplane or by plane, and it still has a 19th century streetcar runs through it. And so it's really quite a wonderful little city or village, if there are such things like that still in Japan. But he comes to New York in 1986 after earning a degree in psychology. Upon coming to New York, he begins to discover earthenware and clay and this art form that he begins to sculpt with clays and with earthenware. And he deliberately goes to the Catskill Mountains and a place that he calls Red Kill, where his studio was located. And he just begins to learn in a very informal way, but also to experience sculpting with clay. So he's essentially a self-taught artist. He didn't study art. He didn't take, extensive coursework. He doesn't have a BFA, MFA. He has a degree in psychology. And as a self-taught artist, I was really, upon seeing both these two works, first, I was really struck by how skillful both the sculpture and the two-dimensional paintings and even the sumi works are, and then realizing what a risk a person or individual takes by working and laboring and learning so much about earthenware and clay for about 20 years, being self-taught, and then completely abandoning it, just dropping it, and then in 2010 began to work in two dimension. And that's an extraordinary shift as far as I'm concerned. Maybe not an extraordinary shift where you begin to look at the elements of what composes or what elements are in the composition of both his sculpture and his paintings, but just in skill and knowing materials to shift from clay and then move on to water-based mediums and then later to acrylic on paper, later on canvas. In one of my early discussions with Ryo, he talked about, because I asked him, I said, why this sudden shift? What happened? These are monumental, not the most monumental, but these are very large scale sculptures that we have upstairs, and they're 200 pounds, and Jun Kaneko makes, 600-700 pound pieces, but they're substantial, and so I asked him, what happened? Why this particular shift? And he said, in terms of the art he's creating, because as an artist, these are, for Ryo, these are beings, these are creatures that kind of emerge from his imagination, or what he says is subconscious. And he said, when I finish or complete a sculpture, I feel that they're stuck. It's static. They have a place, they have mass, they have form, they have expressions. But in living with them, he said he feels that they're stuck. They have an existence, but they're sedentary in a way. And he said, I needed to find some way to sort of release, I think maybe he was talking about his own imagination or his own source of inspiration, and that, he himself was also stuck. And what's this vernacular that's pretty consistent, both in his sculpture and his paintings. And so that's the way he explains it. I also see it as a transition of an artist who was self-taught maturing. This is an artist who, because these paintings, we have 18 paintings that he's completed in 4 years, and that's not extraordinarily prolific, and Ryo is a prolific artist, but I see it also, in my estimation, as an artist who's maturing and is discovering and maturing aesthetic, both in style and the understanding of the materials that he chooses to use to create his aesthetic. And although Ryo and other artists would clearly state that for him, the inspiration dwells in this sort of level of subconscious, it's also my belief, and it's a discussion I've had with him, that a source of imagination is also his own experiences, the day-to-day livelihood that he experiences living now in Manhattan, New York. And the way he sees everything in the world and the elements that he experiences and then brings to his art in endless ways. And these are sort of bits of experiences that are combined. And that's when I thought about the quote that I used to introduce my essay from Gary Schneider,
where he says, wild, as a wild ecosystem, at root, the real question is how we understand concepts of order, freedom, and chaos. Is art an imposition of an order, of a chaotic nature, or is art a matter of discovering the grain of things, uncovering the measured chaos that structures a natural world? So nature also is very important to Toyonaga, both, I think, in that first retreat, that first sort of seeking solitude, from Japan to going to the Catskills and working with something that's earthbound, earthenware. And then you can't escape the natural elements, however surreal they are in the paintings, that, there's a strong element of nature. And as we go upstairs, I'll begin to point out some of my observations that I think, as Ryo matures, he's a mid-career artist, and although he's worked at this for a while, and certainly with ceramics, but as a painter, he's just beginning. And so there's some elements that I see in his paintings that I think are quite based on his own experiences, based on his heritage, based on these ideas of chaos coming from everyday experiences and an artist's ability to bring them together, assemble in very distinct, unique ways, which is, I think, one of the wonderments of this world that Ryo creates upstairs in Awakening. So that's kind of the introduction. And before we go upstairs, I just want to ask if you have any general questions. We can get to specific questions upstairs that I might answer here while we're downstairs. Oh, several, yes.
What was his earlier psychology?
His is Freud and analysis. And so in our discussion, we've talked a lot about the human condition. We talk a lot about sort of anthropological ways of ordering one's mind. We talked a little bit about Levi-Strauss and sort of these opposites of a way you might look at experience.
What was his intent when he was studying psychology?
I'm not quite sure. I've never asked him that. He has many talents and skills. He's also a very accomplished pianist, and so I think I think the way in which he sees creativity and the study of psychology are very closely connected. And we had talked at some point of doing a short video animation of one of his pieces and basically syncing it with one of his original compositions. But that in itself would have been another project. And as close as we got were the suspensions of the papier-mâché pieces in that smaller gallery. And we thought about syncing it to some of his original compositions. And maybe if he feels, first of all, I should tell you, he felt so comfortable, he felt so at home, he felt so at ease being here in Eugene at the Art Museum and with you. He said it was one of the more extraordinary, spectacular experiences he's ever had in a situation where he was anxious and really nervous about sharing these private ideas, which is his art. So maybe he'll allow me to share some of his music with you. You might find it interesting. Yes.
When you say you study psychology, you study Freud and that idea of analysis. Does he talk at all about the difference between that sort of deep study and then when we were upstairs during the walkthrough and people would sort of ask him how he conceptualized certain pieces and he said, I'm just a vehicle.
Right. I'm a messenger.
The fact that there seems to be no analysis, just a process.
Right.
Those seem to sit on two opposite sides.
I think this is one of the wonderful contextualizations when you begin to understand an artist and what makes them creative. I mean, where is this talent and skill and dedication and passion? Where is it? or how's it evolved? I think if he went into deep analysis, it'd be like his three-dimensional. He'll find himself stuck. And so going into his studio and watching him paint, I never did experience him creating something in 3D. I'd go to his studio and kind of see the tools, kilns and things like that, and carving tools. But I did watch him paint. And so there's a painting upstairs where, he'd begin to draw. He drafted out. We have a photograph in the biographical section of the catalog where you see him standing. And you can see where he's painting over loose, graphite and charcoal sketches. And at one point in this piece upstairs, let's see if I can find the image. It's the desert landscape where there are telephone poles. This one. So I saw the sketch that he had on canvas, and this particular element, this creature, was one form. It was, he was working with it, and we went out for lunch. He came back, and he started erasing this entire middle section. And so something happened during lunch, and I don't know exactly what it was. And he said, "Well, it should be broken. It should be, it should, have this sense of its setting." And these sort of weathered telephone poles, and it's just something that I think is better if this actual element, had broken off the main element and things like that. And so, I think if you go deep analysis, you look too much in terms of its symbol or its meaning, and less about the spontaneity of exactly where your imagination might take you. Okay.
I was just curious about the title of the show. Who came up with that title?
Awakening. It's it's a title. It's a consideration that I had going into the exhibit, because I wasn't quite. I mean, it's not like I said, "Ryo, you've got to talk to me." Shaking him, you got to wake you up, and because he's so shy and he's so sort of self-effacing, and I'd gone to I've gone to a couple gallery exhibits of his in New York, and he's always in the background. I mean, if you would look at in the gallery, you wouldn't know who Ryo was. I mean, I thought Debbie's who's Ryo? I thought that was so clever. I mean, because it's the way I felt too. I mean, which one's Ryo? And so it's basically awakening from the very sort of encapsulated sort of three-dimensional pieces to what I think in his narrative paintings are quite extraordinary, quite opening, very, very much sharing more of his references to art, more directly his ideas about the conflict between man and nature, references to Japan, which he wouldn't agree are embodiments within the elements of his sculpture. What did you think about Awakening? I mean, because it means so many different things.
Yeah, I was just curious because so many of his pieces are, they're untitled. So here we have a title for the show,
Right.
and it makes sense, but I just didn't know if he had come up with that or where it came from. And so.
And to me, again, it was also, I thought, a suggestion of an artist at mid-career. Something, he wakes from laboring and moves on to something else.
Does he talk about surrealism?
Oh, to a certain extent, what he's more interested in is what other people see in his work. And so when we begin to talk about, symbology and Freud and these ideas about culture being typed or studied through symbolism and things like that, he finds those conversations quite engaging. And he had so many here And I think that's part of the richness of the experience that he had at the JSMA and with you and the people who attended the events. He was just blown away. Well, okay, yes.
It's the awakening idea, having walked through with the artist and yourself, is like awakening a new world from the inside. Because didn't you have the impression that this is a new vision? I mean, this is not following in somebody's footsteps. This is a very new, I mean, it's so unique that you can't hook it to something else. It stands by itself, and it's his own awakening, and it's also the awakening of the perceptions.
No, I think that's quite, no, that's very true. No, and it's very observant of you. So we need to go upstairs very quickly so we can wrap up this program.
Yeah.
For this show, this is the earliest examples of ceramics. And when I first saw this was sort of laid out in a beautiful sort of harvest banquet table. And they're really, I mean, they're so tactile. They're so fun to sort of hold and cup and grasp and to work with. And I mentioned this, I think, Saturday, or maybe also Friday. To me, this is an exercise that he's in seclusion, he's Red Hill Studio, and he's basically seeing exactly how far his imagination would take him, just beginning with a simple sphere. And so there's the cohesive consistency in the fact that he's working with this sphere, and not too unlike where, again, in Japan, if you were a carver and you were given a nut and you were asked to carve a netsuke. And so you're taking this very simple, uniform shape, and you're going to add character and texture and animation and humor. So the other thing that I think this suggested to me is that even when I began to see initially his paintings that this artist has a sense of humor. It may be very subtle, but it's definitely there. And there's a playfulness and a whimsy in his work. And I think this kind of assemblage and this kind of early investigation where, again, this is where I think artists draw from this experience of who they are. It may be deeply embedded psychologically and through analysis and things like that, but there is humor in this work. I also think that as you're giving your tours and maybe with your younger audience, it's like, especially this time of year, all these children given a pumpkin. And then how many different expressions do you see in a simple, uniform pumpkin that is so creative, so inventive, but so much a character, our own character, of the person, and in this case, the child who's carving this pumpkin. And I love these pieces, and there are some earlier pieces that led up to this that weren't quite so, to me, accomplished, are finished. And these 20 happen to meet that. And I have to tell you that it was very easy selecting this show, because my first question to Ryo is just, whatever we select, whatever I think I find appealing and would like to have represented in your work, you need to tell me and support it with the fact that you feel strong enough that this work, or any of the works in this exhibition, is what you think at that time some of the best work that came from your efforts. The other thing that impresses me, and I'll just use this as an example because it's here, is technically how he forms and shapes his layers and how organic they are. And I mean, he says, these are all hand built. And so building them and shaping them by hand and then layering them. And so, I saw it very much as layers of the skin, bark of a tree, this to me again, resonates to, perhaps the place he is in the Catskills. And then, these tentacles and these kind of, what Suzanne Ramljak in her says, these eyes begin to suggest the fact that, these are, as Ryo would say, these are creatures. These are sort of a being that, in his mind, are alive. And then when you go around and see some of the other three-dimensional pieces, you'll notice that often the back is plain. It's not as adorned or embellished or textured as the face. And so, there are definitely faces in most of the three-dimensional pieces. Something like this also has a function in terms of spew holes. And just when you fire something, you have to have a way for gases and heat and things like that to escape. And so, some of these elements are also functional, although they're so well integrated into the elements of his sculpture, you don't even begin to think about it. And then the other thing that he does as you walk around through the gallery is you'll notice that some of the earthenware pieces have an extraordinary patina. Some of them are more bisque, where they're not burnished, and so they have a more organic sensibility to them. Let's just go around and to see this cluster in the center. Sorry, you're gonna have to move around a bit. So this is an example where there's essentially face and in the back is completely unadorned and unembellished. It's not carved. I think on Saturday he was talking about some of his tools. It's very simple tools. He basically uses sticks and popsicle sticks and chopsticks and things like that to create the texture. But he also talked about letting the material basically help shape the form, help create the sculpture. And so when you begin to work with earthenware of this scale, and certainly at this scale, its own liquidity, its own weight begins to slump. What might be shoulders to one direction or another, or begin to sag in a very, very inventive way. He takes advantage of that, and he lets that natural inclination of the material, earthenware, take its course, and then he begins to build on that, and it becomes integral to a sculpture. And so when you see some of these pieces, they're not, they're organic in appearance and aesthetic, and they're not symmetrical. One end's higher than the other and things like that. A lot of it is because of the nature of the materials. And I thought that, again, that was something that I not talked to him about, and that he was discussing in several conversations he had when he was here over the weekend when we opened. Okay, let's go to the title wall and look at C1. So we're quite fortunate that with this University Art Museum that we have extraordinary students and faculty in other areas that are not American art. And so one particular faculty is Akiko Wally. And certainly you're familiar with the expertise of Anne Rose Kitagawa. And so this being their first painting, I was expecting to see subsequent work that was very Japanesque, and that were going to be contemporary iterations of an Edo period or Edo period landscape and looking at Edo period industrial Japan and things like that. And the fact that, this is one of the few paintings where he uses his Japanese ken, his name here in the lower corner, and he completely turned down, my observations about this painting. He respects and he entertains, and he actually gets very excited when people have interpretations. We were walking through this gallery with various visitors. I mean, they were talking about R. Crumb, the comic artist. They were talking about the filmmaker David Lynch. Of course, we talked about Dr. Seuss and Lorax. And I mean, this is suggestive to the power and accessibility of his art. The fact that people would have conversations with him that, were unfounded in terms of what he thought of when he was painting this. But that's that's the beauty of art. And so I immediately looked at this as a island type of situation, maybe not unlike he had in his hometown island in Japan. I immediately began to see these little red creatures with the industrial embellishments to it and trees attached to them and things like that as having to do with magma, having to do with this sort of a volcanic sort of eruptions. And certainly when I began to look at this piece, which I think is just gorgeous, this has more of a suggestion of red berries. But again, to me, this could be, a volcanic eruption. I mean, Japan lives in the Ring of Fire, and Tokyo itself is surrounded by, 100 volcanoes. And the island is basically one big volcanic, area. So to me, this, we began to talk about magma and things like that. And of course, this is something that Ryo had never thought of. And, but again, he's very delighted the fact that, people come to these ideas based on what Gary Schneider says, or what, other artists have said, there's something about our own experiences that bring meaning to what we find appealing in terms of art. And it's not just visual arts, it's music, it's literature, it's poetry, it's prose. There was a question?
That as curator, you chose that piece next to this piece. Had he ever connected those two when he saw those two?
No, but I do know that these are two of his favorite pieces. And so you're right. I mean, the design of the installation, one, is beautifully lit by, by Kurt and his staff. But the juxtapositions were, they're critical, but they're not always very important. Certainly the paintings or their work that I wanted to present as you walk into the gallery were very critical as far as I was concerned. So I think maybe it's best that we just go around the corner in this direction.